Thank you all for being here today. My name is Ciara Moezidis, and I am a student at the Fletcher School. I'm a MALD first year, focusing on Middle East, North Africa, and human rights violations, and international human rights advocacy. And I'm also a student at Harvard Divinity School. Unfortunately, today, Dr. Azza Karam will be joining us virtually. She had an injury, so she was not able to come from New York. But luckily, oh, there she is. Can we see her? Not yet. We are very, very, very excited to have her. She's an incredibly engaging speaker, and I've had the pleasure of being able to hear her speak a few times over the last year. And we thought as an RLD team, it would make a great amount of sense to invite her. So I will give a quick introduction of Dr. Karam, and we will go from there. Professor Dr. Karam, Azza Karam, serves as the Secretary General of Religions for Peace, the largest multi-religious leadership platform, with 92 national and 6 regional inter-religious councils. She also holds a professorship of religion and development at the University in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, of which she is a citizen. She served as a senior advisor on culture at the UN Population Fund and as coordinator and chair of the UN Interagency Task Force on Religion and Development, and was the founder of the Multi-Faith Advisory Council of the UNIATFRND. That's a big acronym. In those capacities, she coordinated engagement with members of the Global Interfaith Network for Population Development with over 600 faith-based organizations from all regions of the world, representing all religions and interreligious affiliations. Additionally, Professor Karam has served in different positions in the UN since 2004, as well as other intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations since the early 1990s. She also did her PhD and focused on political Islam, and which became her first book in Arabic and in English. She was born in Egypt and now lives in the United States. She has a very long bio because she is a very, very successful woman. So we have that online as well if you would like to read more about Dr. Karam. But I'm excited to welcome her to the floor to give some remarks about these intersections at our 7th annual conference on religion, cultural heritage, conservation, and crisis. Dr. Karam, you can take it away. Thank you so much for being here with the Fletcher community.
Thank you very much, Ciara, for that very lovely introduction. You honor me way too much. I am delighted to be with you. I am so sorry I could not be physically with you. Heaven knows I was so looking forward to it. It's one of the few times when I actually feel like life is good. I get to speak with folks, especially all y'all in this place. So please forgive me for not being able to be with you. And who knows, maybe by the end of our conversation, you'll be glad I wasn't there at all, actually. And I was only there offline. So there we are. It's a great privilege and a great pleasure to be with you all today. I have a very simple task, which would ordinarily require probably about a few years, but I'll do my best to fit it in to about 15 minutes. I intend to try to provoke. If anything is unclear or indeed provocative, then I have succeeded, but do feel free to ask about anything and everything that you wish in the context of what I'm about to share. In a preparatory conversation with Ciara, the idea was to try to say and link aspects of culture, aspects of conservation, with aspects of diplomacy and politics at large. Let me just walk you through a few important basics, if you will. A lot of people often ask why religion matters and what's the religious got to do with it beyond war and strife and all that sort of stuff. And I think, let me just point out a few very simple facts and data. I'm fairly sure, at least I hope, that most of you know that in terms of the impact of culture, culture is supposed to be about how we think, what we believe, and how we behave. Think about that. Think, believe, behave as a broad definition of culture. It often is rather interesting to me that in spite of that sort of overall definition, many people think that the believe part isn't really that significant. Think and behave, yes, we get it. Art, poetry, all that stuff makes sense. But believe, in fact, think, believe, behave is as comprehensive an understanding of culture as there possibly is. Now, if we consider a Pew Research poll that came out in 2012, which identified, it was a global poll, and it came up with a very interesting fact that 84% of the world's population, that's roughly 8 out of 10, actually profess to belonging to a particular faith or religious tradition. That's 8 out of 10 people who belong to a particular religious tradition, i.e. are in some way, shape, or form believers. Now, we don't know whether they are fully performing every single ritual of their belief system, but they are believers, 8 out of 10 people. So that broad definition of culture and cultural heritage, which claims that it's about belief, how we believe, what we believe, is a direct connection there. So what people believe, their religion, their faith tradition, is in fact one at least of the very critical components of culture. Now, interestingly, however, if you look at the design of many of our especially Western institutions, whether they are academic or intergovernmental, scientific, culture is almost distant from any belief system. It's as if this is what you think and this is your belief, and then there's culture. It's a false dichotomy. In fact, religions are very much part of culture. Religious systems are very much part of cultural infrastructure, even. So there are some of those who would say, well, actually, faith and religion is about spiritual enterprise, and we really need to distinguish it from organized religion as well as religious institutions. And that's actually quite true. It's fair enough. You can distinguish all you like. At the end of the day, however, we also should realize that faith transcends and defies definition. It doesn't get captured in any one space or place. At the same time, faiths define tremendously an impact on what we think, what we believe, and therefore how we behave. In other words, faiths writ large are a significant part of culture. We also know that, frankly, religious institutions, churches, mosques, synagogues, all sorts of things affiliated to them, anyway, are very much visible, tangible parts of our ordinary, everyday infrastructure. You can't avoid it. The interesting thing, of course, is that the more you go into rural, hard-to-reach areas, the more you will notice the presence of the church or the mosque or the synagogue or all of the above. In other words, where secular institutions may not be as visible, religious institutions most definitely are. The furthest away from the urban centers and spaces, you will find the religious institutions. In the heart of urban centers and spaces, you will find religious institutions. So the idea that you can kind of ignore this or quantify it or put it aside or marginalize that value added because nobody goes there anyway, they're physically there. They're physically there, okay? But there's some other very important things to bear in mind. Religions, whatever faith traditions we believe in or we have, are actually social and cultural gatekeepers. In other words, the way we understand our culture, the way that we relate to what is done, what is not done, norms, attitudes, is actually, or are actually deeply informed by different faith traditions. We may not even realize it, and yet that is very much true. Why some of the gender differences in upbringing and socialization have a lot to do, roots in certain religious ideas and understandings, norms and values. So social and cultural gatekeepers, definers of how people behave and what they think. Another reason is, quite frankly, whether we like it or not, religious institutions and religious infrastructure till today is the largest, oldest, and most far-reaching social service providers. So today we think in terms of pension systems, in terms of ministries of health, institutions of health. Actually, the original schools, clinics, hospitals And the ones still functioning to serve now, even in the United States of America, 70% of hospitals are actually administered in some way, shape, or form through the Catholic Church. We have not even begun to include the other religious institutions and establishments. 70% of basic healthcare in the United States is still provided through the Catholic institutions. How can we ignore that, especially when we've gone through COVID, where we've realized that the entire health infrastructure, not only in the United States, but globally, has more or less struggled to survive and to serve, definitely struggled to serve needs. There's been a massive impact between supply and demand. If the basic health infrastructure still continues to be very much administered by religious institutions, then how dare we think that we can talk about enhancing healthcare without thinking of those institutions and how they play a very critical role in providing that basic healthcare. And you know what? It gets even more complicated and almost unquantifiable when we start thinking of schools. We often hear very pejoratively of madrasas. Oh, they're terrible. They're run, Quranic hospital, Quranic schools, etc. Terrible places. Actually, whether they are terrible or not is irrelevant. The fact is that they exist. They still serve the majority of rural children in many parts of the world. Madrasas are schools, and a lot of young people still go through them. But why are we forgotten? And do we ignore the fact that many of the most prominent universities in the United States are Catholic or inspired by religious traditions and run with religious through an original ethic of religion? So when it comes to education, we're even more impressed by the amount of religious institutions that have a role to play in the provision of basic education globally, not only in the so-called developed part of the world. So effectively, if we look at other countries, developing countries in particular, we realize that religious institutions have a very critical role to play in providing basic social services. COVID taught us visually something very, very critical, that religious actors, religious institutions, and their affiliated non-governmental entities are actually the first responders in humanitarian crises. It isn't just the folks who parachute in to help and then leave in an earthquake or in a war. It's actually that religious institutions are already there, and they're the first responders. They're already serving, and they will continue to serve long after international actors who are far better known need to leave a country. They continue. Religious institutions are from the community, they're about the community, and they continue to serve the communities. But then wait, before we forget, religious actors, religious institutions today in the US Congress, there are people elected who are actually ordained. So we're talking about religious actors who are vested in politics, political institutions, who work side by side and are sometimes called upon by religious leaders, by political leaders. In fact, just last week, I believe, there was something called a prayer breakfast here in this country. A national prayer breakfast is a big deal. It's a massive organization, actually, that puts it together. Why do we have a national prayer breakfast in the United States of America, to which, by the way, aspirants, politicians, secular leaders from so many parts of the world aspire for an invitation, to an invitation? National prayer breakfast in the United States of America. Such a good idea, in fact, that Germany has decided to implement its own. So we think that religion and politics are distinct and separate and do not influence each other. How? They do. But, as some would always push back and say, wait a minute, but they influence negatively, don't they? Indeed, they might, but not always. And it is incongruent and illogical to believe that religions only influence in a negative way. I may be contradicting myself in a second, but bear with me. One more fact about religious institutions and faith communities that I think is very critical, and we often underestimate it. The largest amount of volunteers, people who volunteer their time and service, are actually religiously inspired and or work with religious institutions and actors. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of the fact that a lot of women and young people work in and through churches, on weekends, serving communities, etc. The trend increased dramatically during COVID because these religious institutions became hubs for serving communities, and plenty volunteers come. In fact, if we want to look at the largest numbers of volunteer workforces in the world, they tend to be huddled around religious institutions. So in terms of human resources, religious institutions and religious spaces are still incredibly powerful actors and servants of communities. Now, remember I said I might be contradicting myself in a second. So we know that, or some of us should know, would we possibly have heard of the Habsburg Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Tsarist Russia, the Ottoman Empire? You know those original political entities that ruled over large tracts of land? Interesting point. Most of them were actually ruling very, very strongly with the religious institutions. The Catholic Church was extremely powerful in many of these old empires. Islamic thought, Islamic leaders were very much part of the Ottoman Empire. So indeed, the relationship between religion and politics goes back deeper and longer than the current secular institutions of government and governance and service providers as we know them today. They don't disappear. One of our leaders, a Lutheran pastor from Jerusalem, coined it very well when we hosted a global conference on faith and diplomacy. And there was a whole bunch of diplomats from all over the world. And he looked at them and he said, do you really think that diplomacy is entirely your business and you're the ones who invented it? Do you not realize that religious leaders are the original diplomats? From long ago, it was actually religious leaders who would deal with one another across the empires of old. It was religious leaders who would say, we need to go with this, we need to fight this war. Anybody forgot the Crusades? Religions have been a very critical part of political infrastructure since time immemorial. If not, sometimes the ones that actually defined politics for a great deal of time. Now, the interesting thing is this is not just the past, this is very much the present. Many of you are aware of how critical the religious belief system was to decisions made in the Supreme Court here in the United States. Many of you are aware of how important religious leaders have been and continue to be, not only here, but in many parts of the world. So to assume that religion and politics are not actually pretty close to one another and have historically and traditionally been so is to not understand about our political history and is to not understand what is going on in present day world. Which brings us to the present day context, which is, has anybody heard of Metropolitan Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, the largest Orthodox church? What is Metropolitan Kirill perhaps most known for today? I would venture to suggest that he's known for many things, one of which is the fact that he has authorized this war that Russia is waging against Ukraine. Metropolitan Kirill is on record as saying to the millions of Russian Orthodox believers, and they are in the millions, that this is a holy war. Some of you may have been relatively sentient around the time that George Bush, former president of the United States, actually, after 9/11, mandated an important war in Afghanistan and in Iraq. I'm not sure how many of you may be equally aware of the fact that there were circles in political institutions and establishments, in academic institutions and establishments, where certain religious actors came together to say, it is a just war, a just war. In other words, even our present day moment has been, in many ways, influenced by the religious political nexus. So can you honestly tell me that when we now talk about diplomacy, it wouldn't matter? Religions don't matter, faiths don't matter? Before you think they matter, and they matter only pejoratively, think of another basic fact that I just spoke to, which is that the original social service providers, the original volunteers, the first responders in most communities around the world in humanitarian crises are the religious institutions. So before we take all of the religious and put them in the bag of the not likable, if not the deplorable, let us please remember to be a bit more balanced about the fact that that which is religious influences all, the good and the not so good. at a minimum, when we think of diplomacy, and we are intent on focusing on the religious as the negative, as what is influencing the negative, then we need to realize that no diplomat is a half-decent diplomat if she or he does not take into account what are the causes of the anguish that they are supposed to be addressing. And if the cause is religious extremism or religious ideas, then no diplomat can do their job effectively without taking those ideas into account. So whichever way you look at it, religious literacy, some form of knowledge about the impact of religion on our day-to-day culture and dynamic, including our institutions, some knowledge of that is important. And when you look at diplomacy in the secular context, you will realize that most of the secular political establishments, as we know them, that practice the so-called art of diplomacy, tend to be rather ignorant about the role of religion. So there's a deficiency in our knowledge that is impacting on how we behave with one another. There is a deficiency in our knowledge because we cannot negotiate a peace to a conflict that has been mandated or validated by religious arguments. Our diplomacy will be not just insufficient, but downright inefficient. What has all this got to do with conservation? Indeed, what does religion have to do with conservation at all? A few interesting facts. Fact number one, religious institutions are actually amongst the largest landowners in this world. They own land, and the land has rivers, and it has streams, and it has desert, and it has trees, and it has all the things that have to do with our environment. They own these spaces, and they're the largest landowners, i.e., they are actually quite responsible for the maintenance and conservation of these territories that they own. But wait, it's not just the land, it's not just the earth that they own. Do we know that actually religious pilgrimages take place on so many different days of the year and involve literally hundreds of millions of people? Why do pilgrimages matter? They matter because that's movement of people. They matter because if you own a space and if you're a pilgrim, what you do with yourself will have an impact on that earth that you tread. So where we have pilgrimages, we have a necessary need for greening the entire process of a pilgrimage. Those who undertake it need to have a basic savvy of being conscious of what they litter, what they don't litter, how much water they eat, they conserve, what they do with the food. In other words, religious pilgrimages, which are to the tune literally of hundreds of millions per year. I mean, if you only look at the Kumbh Mela, which is in the Hindu context, you realize that we're talking 50 to 30 million people on average being present in one space for this and journeying towards the space. That's a lot of people. Think about the Hajj, Muslim Hajj in Mecca, 2.5 million pilgrims before COVID. That's a lot of people in one place. We don't even have the data for Buddhist pilgrimage sites, but we do know that at least 350,000 people trek on the Catholic Camino de Santiago every year. We're talking massive movements of people for religious reasons that has a direct implication on what we need to understand in terms of our environment and its conservation. So whether we understand these dynamics or not, those are just some basic facts. We know, therefore, that having some kind of basic religious literacy is important to understand what it is that makes people take institutions serve and wars, and therefore peace, take place. Because we know that religion is also part of how people believe and behave. Many of the practices that we think of today in terms of early marriage, early child marriage in some parts of the world, or female genital mutilation in others, are actually inspired and seem to be perpetuated through some kind of a belief system. And countless efforts have been taken to say this is illegal, should not happen. Cultural efforts. It is only when religious leaders intervene, it is only when religious leaders use their pulpits that you can see some impact on some of those practices, which, by the way, when it comes to early and child marriage, are often performed by religious leaders. So we need to have a certain kind of religious literacy if we're trying to be humanitarians, if we're trying to be social service providers, if we're trying to be politicians, if we're trying to be diplomats. Religious politics are very much on the rise in our context today. It isn't just ISIS that we are so worried and scared about. ISIS is but one of the many phenomena where the religious arguments are being manipulated to justify violence. But this is happening in many parts of the world. I trust that you know that the National Prayer Breakfast don't have anything to do with violence, and yet they are spaces of remarkable power and influence. So again, religion has a remarkable role to play in our diplomatic, our cultural heritage, in our reality of who we are, the way that we behave. Being able to be informed about it, therefore, is not a luxury, but is an absolute necessity. However, once you are informed, what we're witnessing now is everybody's talking about religion and agriculture even. The question isn't whether we can appreciate the role of religions in our lives and understand how significant they are, but the questions really are, how is it that different religions effectively coexist or not? And how is it that when we start to acknowledge the importance of the religious sectors writ large, we may at the same time actually be causing harm? Why? Because you see, it isn't about His Holiness Pope Francis and the entire Vatican or Catholic Church, which is massive, doing good. That's not enough. Ultimately, as we acknowledge the value added and the criticality of the role of the religious, we must also be able to hold accountable each religious institution, each religious actor, for whether or not they are able to work together for one another and their communities, not only whether they are seen to be champions of their own religious faith, but actually the litmus test of understanding how effective as diplomats, religious leaders and religious actors are. The litmus test is the extent to which they serve other faith communities. They have the same respect for other faith traditions. And one last litmus test, how much do they value and respect and give official acknowledged accreditation and decision-making power to the diverse genders amongst their communities and those of others? Those are our litmus test. And if they do that, then we know that they will also take on board the basics of human rights. They will also take on board the basics of and the fundamentals of the imperative to conserve not only humans, but the planet on which the humans live. Those litmus tests are not a luxury that we can think of doing. They have to be how we identify the realms of religion and how we deal and engage with them. In 99.9% of the cases, the religious leaders on my board, whom I have the privilege to serve, and they represent all faith traditions, including indigenous peoples. The religious leaders on my board are a unique group of human beings, however. They're not just any religious leaders. Why? Because they're all actively committed and have proven themselves to be able to stand alongside one another in defense of each other, not only of their own communities, and they have all upheld the importance of gender equality and women's empowerment. These are special people with a special mandate and a special role to play. War is made by those who refuse to see or acknowledge the validity of the existence of the other, let alone their belief systems. But peace is waged by those who will stand alongside and stick their neck out, even when people in their own community, fellow believers, don't like what they're saying. Peace is waged by religious leaders who work together, who collaborate together, who serve one another's communities. And that litmus test must never be overlooked. Unfortunately, however, it is being overlooked. In the rush to engage with religious leaders, religious actors, religion, and we have forgotten, we overlook, we undermine the golden rule of religious peacemakers and peace builders, which is that they stand together no matter what. They serve each other and their communities no matter what. And they believe in human rights and serve those too. Thank you.
Well, I have no questions. You answered all of the questions I prepared. I'm just kidding. Thank you so much for those insightful remarks, Dr. Karam. I think I told her to prepare some spicy remarks. She had a lot of punchy things just within the time that she just spent right now. And I kind of, before going into some of the follow-ups on a few things, I wanted to ask, I think we all need to understand like our positionalities and what brings us into our work, because if we don't understand where we're coming from, if we don't have that deep reflection, then we can kind of lose sight of what actually our vision and our mission and our vocation is. And so because you didn't touch on it, I was curious if you could kind of share, I think everyone would benefit for understanding just a little bit about your upbringing and background in order to understand how you even got here in the first place at Religions for Peace, at the UN, in all of these positions that were really connected to religion being at the forefront.
Okay, I was born into a Muslim family, a very observant Muslim family, but a very, I would say, enlightened and progressive one. So there was never any question about the importance and the value of my education and the best possible, highest level of education. I always had my family's support, some members of my family's support, for instance, even to decide to do a PhD. But from a very early age, it was very clear to me that I grew up in Egypt, where there have always been tensions between religious and political sides. And some of those tensions are sometimes in how the political wishes to use the religious arguments and religious leaders to justify their basic illegitimacy. We haven't had a democratic government in Egypt for quite some time. And invariably, the process of governance has been legitimized through and by religious arguments and some of the religious establishments, which is why when there was political opposition, the opposition was also in religious garb. It was about, no, this is not a justifiable way of governing. Non-democratic governance is actually non-religious government. So that's been one of the reasons why, as governments have used and abused religion to justify their means of illegitimacy, some of the reactions and the resistance to them has come in with that religious argument. And that precisely is what always drew my attention. Why is it that both sides, those who are governing illegitimately, try to use religion, and those who are trying to oppose the illegitimate governance also use religion? And it came down very clearly to the fact that religion is everybody's language. I'm not just talking about Islam, I'm talking about Islam and Christianity. In deeply religious societies, in deeply religious cultures, which is actually 8 out of 10 people remember around the world, so actually the rest of the world, religion is part of our lives. It is a very normal part of our lives. It is how we think, believe, and behave, so we cannot avoid it. So I grew up learning that lesson very clearly as I observed the political dynamics around me. Being a human rights defender from a very young age, I could also understand that being conversant in why and how religions mattered so much was actually a requirement to be a defender of human rights as well, that you could not convince people of secular arguments if you were not understanding the provenance of their culture. And the culture that emphasizes the existence of justice and God and mercy is critical to understanding, therefore, what is unjust, what is unmerciful, and what is illegitimate. So I grew up with that understanding and started working systematically in that nexus between human rights, democracy, and culture and religious context. And the more I became interested, especially in women's rights issues, as that litmus test of the whole human rights debate, the more I realized that religions have a very important role to play in the arguments, whether for or against human rights, and especially women's rights, because those who oppress women love to do so in the name of religion. And those who succeed best in countering the oppression of women do so when they ground their arguments within religious understandings. That doesn't mean that they have to become religious, but it does mean that in order to part of the fight against the oppression, any oppression, but especially women's oppression, it is an oppression that is justified by religion needs to be countered also by and through religious argumentation. one has to be at least savvy, not necessarily a practitioner, but at least savvy about the kind of whip that is used to whip us. We must know what it is made from. We must know why it is used in order to be able to not be whipped by it.
Yeah, this definitely goes back to the religious and cultural literacy arguments that I think people dismiss because they're put into silos a lot of the time, and religion is pushed to the side, even though it should be kind of grounded in all of our understanding about the world around us. So I think your positionality makes that quite clear, of that need for this literacy. So I guess as a follow-up to that, I know that you said you pursued a PhD focused on political Islam, and I know we briefly talked about this, how I'm curious how this focus has shifted a lot since your degree, and sharing the salient ways how it has, especially looking just with the politicization of religion, the religionization of politics, in many, many cases, India, Iran, Israel, to name a few, but many, many more. I wanted to, if you could share your thoughts on that evolution and the implications for the future, I think that'd be really insightful.
Well, it's interesting because when I first was doing my research on political Islam in many parts of the Arab world, it was considered then that really Islam is the only thing where politics comes in. Islam is the only religion which has something to do with politics, and it's always harmful and terrible and awful and so on and so forth. And Islamic fundamentalism was a big thing. The truth, however, and I think you'll find some very brilliant work done by Professor Scott Appleby and Professor Martin Marty many years ago in the 80s, tomes on religious fundamentalisms, where they didn't just focus on Islam, they actually looked at different forms of religious fundamentalisms the world over. And this was an eye-opener for me to realize, oh, it's not just Islam, is it? How interesting. Let's see how this actually plays out. At that time, in the late 1980s, it was considered esoteric to look at religious fundamentalisms. But actually, I think what has happened is, first of all, when you study religionization in politics, or the nexus between religion and politics, when you study that, you realize, I mean, this is coming at it from a consciousness that is deeply political, a political consciousness approach, a political science approach, that religion is the origin of politics as we know it today. Religious institutions and their engagement with one another have actually been the original politicians, discussing and debating and carving the world out between themselves. Colonialism, which still remains deeply impactful in many parts of the world, and we see and hear resonance of it in international development and international foreign policy practices. Colonialism was quintessentially informed by a religious argument, which is the white man's burden, la mission civilisatrice, the importance of Christianity bringing light to the rest of the world. We know that today, as my work has taken me across the international development spectrum, trying to understand and to engage with different religious institutions and organizations in international development, it is very clear that the largest religious actors out there who are providing educational services, health services, humanitarian relief, are actually Christian religious actors. Why? Because they've been quite active for a long time. Their legacy is deep and profound, and it's not all bad, by the way, but it is a legacy of having been governing and providing aid to governance and providing service to communities for a very long time. So until today, when we look at the realms of religion in international politics, as they slowly become more visible to many, we'll see that the dominant arguments and argumentation still remains that of and about the Christian world. Open the New York Times on an average Saturday, and you'll find that there's a page on religion that is almost entirely all about the Holy See or the Vatican or the Pope, and perhaps one or two other Christian ideas, aspects, movements, whatever. It remains the case that yes, while Christians are the majority, they are not the only religious community. But the fact that we see the prism of the world and politics and international development through a Christian prism, that even when we try to engage with religious actors, they end up being majority Christian, tells us a lot about how the religious dominance persists, but also which kind of religious dominance still is very much there, including in the spaces for liberation, human rights, and so on and so forth. So I found that even though I started with political Islam, I had assumed that the international development experience and engagement would eventually minimize the value of doing political Islam, learning about political Islam. But I realized instead that I was rather well equipped to see the trend that is happening today. So when Metropolitan Kirill declares that the Russian war on Ukraine is holy, I am not surprised. Plenty others are. But those of us who came out and emerged from a study of religion and politics are not remotely surprised, because that's been the historical reality for so many in the world. Secularization, after all, really only happened in Western Europe, which is tiny on the map of the world and is an even tinier amount of people. The rest of the world, as I started my presentation saying, the rest of the world remains mired in religious understandings and criticality. So in fact, studying the nexus of religion and politics stands you in good stead to understand what is happening politically today, what is happening in the defense and military realms today, and what is happening in international development, education, health today. It is important to understand that if anything, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, which everybody heralded and celebrated as, there you go, communism failed, socialism failed, it's all about liberalism and capitalism. Deeply sorry, liberalism and capitalism have not mobilized significantly populations in the same way that these age-old ideologies did. But what is replacing them increasingly is religious understandings, religious beliefs. It's a religious ideology that seems to be predominant today. And we can see it in almost every corner of the world, not just the Muslim world.
Thank you for that explanation. I also think as a divinity school student, we talk a lot about how there is no one form of any religion. And when it comes to, like, we talk about Islamic fundamentalism, but there are many fundamentalisms. She brought up Scott Appleby. Definitely give that a read. There are, even when it comes to secularism, there's not one form of secularism either. And so I think this nuance is really important to bring into this conversation. And I appreciate you mentioning that, Dr. Karam. I guess moving on to cultural heritage and the broader theme of this conference, I want to know, I know you covered this throughout your remarks at the beginning, but what immediately comes to mind when you think of cultural heritage, and how does the importance of religious and cultural literacy connect to that definition of cultural heritage? And do you feel that there is a difference between the two? Is there a gap that you believe is critical to understand or bridge? I was wondering if you can explore with us a little bit more on that.
So I think it's, first of all, important to find out if you know about UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, which has this series of heritage sites around the world, that the bulk of the heritage sites declared as UNESCO heritage sites, i.e. therefore supposed to be protected and nurtured around the world, are actually religious sites. It says a great deal right then and there to appreciate that the religious is deeply part of the cultural heritage, that religious institutions are part of the cultural heritage of the world today, whether we appreciate that or not. That's one point. The second point is what I referred to earlier. Religious institutions remain critical landowners and influencers of mass movement of people. So if we talk about cultural heritage as the very earth that we have inherited and the need to nourish and protect and sustain it, then having masses of people move across it, whether on flight or on land, is something that we need to appreciate, has to do with the role of the religious institution and the religious infrastructure. And last but by no means least, when I first joined the UN in 2006 or something, I did for myself a research to see which United Nations system entity had engaged the most and the longest with different religious institutions and actors around the world. And lo and behold, it turned out to be the United Nations Environment Programme. So the United Nations Environment Programme was one of the first entities to engage, i.e. to partner with religious leaders, religious institutions, and religious actors in order to get their work done on environmental awareness raising and conservation. We then realized that this was not only happening while the bulk of attention was on the Christian partnerships with Christian world, there was actually plenty going on also with Taoist and Confucian context. So the point here is, even when it comes to multilateral systems such as the United Nations and the way that they engage on environmental protection, the oldest heritage of that engagement is with the religious institutions, actually. So the same thing also applies to UNICEF when it comes to the rights of the child. UNICEF is the second institution to have worked with religious actors in the UN for many, many years, but nobody beats the record of UNEP in that engagement. Today, when we look at what happened in the last COP, the COP27 that took place in Sharm el-Sheikh, we realize that it was the first time, but it had been building steadily. It was the first time that you had 40 different side events, 40 side events that were made about and by religious groups and on religious issues. 40. That's a massive number of side events, quite frankly. But what it tells you is that religious actors have long invested in and mobilized around issues of cultural conservation, especially the conservation of the environment, because that has been their purview. They need to know what is going on. Why some monasteries today in many parts of the world that are increasingly facing desertification, what are they doing to counter the desertification, the lack of water that they have to deal with? That's a very pertinent, very existential crisis. It is faced by the institutions living there. And like I said, the most remote are usually the religious institutions. So any which way we look at it in terms of about the way people are affecting and impacting people's behavior, very significant impact is traced to how and what religious leaders and institutions and idioms have to say about the environment in many parts of the world. Whether it's about the way we behave as human beings in terms of conservation of our environment and the important role we have as stewards thereof, whether it's about actual physical, tangible land and ownership of it and the responsibility for it, whether it's about partnerships that have been about raising awareness and securing even plans for greening pilgrimages. And remember, I told you that it's in the hundreds of millions of people. In all of those very critical moments, cultural conservation in terms of our environmental conservation has a great deal to do with the religious domains.
And I guess going off of the theme of cultural heritage, I want to ask you something more along the lines of accountability, because we just had a panel on preservation and destruction of cultural heritage. And we have institutions in place to hold, or at least try to hold, governments accountable. And I want to know kind of your take on faith actors and religious institutions and accountability, and what that even could look like, does look like now when it comes to committing human rights violations, or like you had mentioned, the child marriage example, FGM. These are all instances where when it comes to governments, you can point the finger and say, you know, do something and accuse them of this, but obviously no religion is a monolith. Many religions don't have a point person. So what does that look like, or what do you envision? I would love to hear more about that.
Thank you, Ciara. It's one of my favorite subjects, if only because it's a very frightening idea that actually religious political institutions, say governments, technically at least, we aspire, we hope, we pray, are held accountable by their rule of law that they themselves are supposed to oversee and secure and provide. Mm-hmm. But who's holding religious institutions accountable? What holds religious institutions accountable? Because religions transcend territory, it is extremely difficult to apply one uniform set of laws that have to do with accountability on any religious institution, unless it is the same accountability in the same territory or country. But the truth of the matter is that the strength of that which is faith and religious is also the greatest weakness, and therefore something that we need to be alert to. When we speak about the criticality of religious engagement in matters of cultural conservation, matters of human rights, matters of democratic accountability of countries and governments, we also have to realize that religious institutions very often are hard in their entirety to hold accountable. So therefore, this brings us to what one of the lessons learned in a movement like Religions for Peace, which has which convenes all the different religious institutions and faith communities of the world. One of the many lessons learned over 52 years of existence and practice and engagement and collaboration is that the only way you can actually begin to hold religious institutions accountable to some degree is to hold them accountable to whether they're working together for one another or whether they insist on only doing their own thing. And one of the lessons of COVID, one of the least palatable lessons of COVID, was that many religious institutions, as primary healthcare providers, as first responders in humanitarian crises, were actually working at the rate of 1,001% to serve communities. But were they working together? Are you working together? And if so, how? And to what extent are you working together to safeguard the rights of the most vulnerable, rather than to cherry pick the specific rights that you happen to like? Those are the two questions that have to be leveraged for all of those religious actors and institutions. Are you working together? Are you working together to safeguard the rights of the most vulnerable? And if so, how? That set is the means of accountability, and frankly, the only means of accountability that we have. And it's important, therefore, and part of what Religions for Peace's mission has been, is to not so much the stick approach, you got to be accountable, but more like, can you please work together? Shall you work together on this? How about we work together? What do you need to facilitate this process? It sounds facetious, it sounds very simple, and yet it is one of the most difficult jobs. I sometimes joke and say God couldn't make it possible for all the religions to work together. How on earth are we mere human mortals supposed to do that? And yet at the same time, that frankly is the only way that you can begin to at least observe the extent to which they're accountable. Religious institutions behave like any other institution, except that they lack the fact that there's a transnational accountability framework for them. Whereas we have international humanitarian law, we have international human rights law, which we demand that those acting in those spaces as non-governmental actors observe. How many of us have actually noted or tracked which religious institutions remain and hold themselves accountable to those two sets of international norms and standards? We have yet to understand that. We have yet to look at it critically, and that is what we actually need to do.
That's a big task. I think that collective responsibility is really critical. And yeah, I mean, religious institutions have been first responders and have truly been trailblazers in a lot of these efforts. And at the same time, there are instances around the world with many different faith traditions where accountability and justice is also necessary. And so that you mentioned Religions for Peace. I want to talk about that, of course. I will share a brief anecdote. Last semester, I was in Professor Ruhana's Theories of Conflict Resolution course, if some of you have taken it, and we had a class on religion and this idea of religion and violence versus religion and peace. And, you know, is when we think of religion and violence or religion and peace, what comes to mind first? And are both paradigms true? And people could not really understand this idea that religious groups, interfaith actors can come together at a table and talk about what peace building efforts look like. It just, for some people, it wasn't the most intuitive idea because everyone's coming from different frameworks. Everyone's understanding of peace, justice might look different. And so people were just not buying religious groups being a part of peace building. And I was like, have you heard of Religions for Peace in the class? And a lot of people were like, oh no, I have to check it out. So I plugged that organization, and now I'm talking to you, Dr. Karam. And so with that, I would love to hear more about both specifically Religions for Peace, because in an article that I recently read, you said at Religions for Peace, it was normal to talk about religion. You don't even think about it. But the UN was a completely different culture to come to terms with. The general message around the UN was, we don't talk about faith. We don't do religion. So I want to talk about this. For those who are not familiar with Religions for Peace, can you provide an overview of this interreligious council structure and how it functions and why you feel this is so critical?
Sure. So first of all, that's actually a lot of questions in one. Can I thank you for plugging Religions for Peace? And I very much appreciate it. It does make my time worthwhile, and I can now validate it to the board that I serve. So
there you go.
A couple of basics. Point number one, all faith traditions from native heritage and ways of thinking, all the way to the most established institutions, such as the Vatican, all faith traditions speak to and about peaceful coexistence, peace as a state of mind, peace as a necessary reality for human beings, peace as what we do when we look after ourselves and the earth that we live in. All faith traditions speak to that. So the idea that religion is only about violence is as absurd as the idea that skin color defines who we are and what we do and what we believe in. It's as absurd. Religions are belief systems. They are remarkably varied. They are massive in terms of their adherence. They are larger in adherence than any other ideology or institution. To assume that they are all about harm and violence is truly absurd. To understand the essence of faith as peace is why some degree of religious literacy is actually rather helpful. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to study Islam 101 or Christianity 102 or whatever. It's about understanding that actually faiths are the essential and quintessential space from which peace is supposed to emanate. Yoga, for those of you who may, I hope, be familiar, yoga isn't about violence, and yoga is actually a spiritual practice. It's a spiritual practice. It's about a practice of faith. Now, if anybody thinks yoga is harm, do have a conversation with somebody to help you work through that. But in principle, faith is about peace and the means of it. Now, we don't always do a fine job of it, clearly, because human beings will always be fallible. It's why some of us would like to believe in something other than human beings, or human beings plus, if you will. But one of the presets, if you will, of an institution like Religions for Peace. And by the way, the oldest multi-religious structure that is about religions and peace is the Parliament of World Religions, which was founded in 1880 something. Okay. And it was built on this idea in modern day life that we need to come together to be people of peace. And every few years, the parliament holds an assembly. The next one is going to take place in Chicago. They usually hold it in different parts of the world, where thousands of people come together. And the entire conversation that takes place in these massive conferences and assemblies is fundamentally about what is happening around the world to bring and make and realize peace in environment and personal relationships and politics and health and you name it. 1880 something, okay? Now, in 1970, at the height of the nuclear war, which we seem to be reliving at the moment, it's amazing how the more things change, the more they stay the same. But at the height of that nuclear terror that was taking place in 1970, where we assumed that there would be a nuclear holocaust at any point in time, thank you so much to the USSR at that point and USA and the tensions between them, etc., a group of religious leaders came together and said, yeah, we have the United Nations, which is supposed to have been built to secure peace, such that no man shall ever lift up a sword or a plow against anybody else, and they're only going to do it for agriculture. But you know something? It ain't enough. Looks like that political government structures really actually could do with moral, spiritual support, that support that only religious leaders and institutions know to leverage, have been leveraging since time immemorial. We need to come together to support the governments and the peoples of this world to help realize an agenda of peace. At that time, it was rooted in the nuclear fears. That was the founding of Religions for Peace. Since then, it has significantly grown in number. Today, like I said, we have the Catholic representatives at the senior-most level, all the way to the indigenous peoples representation. And that is one of the many remarkable strengths of it. It is not an understanding of religion as an institution that is established, because that way we would lose out quite a lot of faith traditions. It is an understanding and a practice of bringing together and convening faiths from almost all walks of life, from from all corners of the world, and they come together as peers. No one is better than the other, no matter how many adherents they have. Each is a faith tradition to be respected in its own right. But what do? Do they only meet every 5 years? No, they don't only meet every 5 years. At the national level, they come together to form interreligious councils. These interreligious councils will assess how and what they work and develop together so that they're addressing development, humanitarian, and human rights needs. And peace and security is at the heart of their agenda. Are they always doing peace and security? No. In fact, many of these interreligious councils, of which we have over 90, many of them are struggling today because, as they are being perceived as important by defunct, illegitimate politicians, they are being used. Their different leaders are being used to help justify either a conflict within the country, a conflict with another country, a political conflict between different political parties. We are living today at an era when the abuse of religious doctrine, religious beliefs, and religious leaders is quite rife. Now, is this abuse happening because the religious leaders are just helplessly being used? No. This abuse is also in part happening because some religious leaders are only too happy to be used, as long as they get a seat of political influence at a particular table. Some of them are like that too. The idea, and therefore I keep coming back to it, the idea of Religions for Peace is that you must convene all the faiths as equals to serve all together, barring none. That is a critical litmus test. That is what Religions for Peace has learned from its over 52 years of convening religious leaders and their institutions and faith communities at the national, at the regional, and at the global level. They are convened to converse with one another for sure, but they are convened to speak as one voice for sure, but they are also convened to serve communities practically, pragmatically, together on whatever the needs of those communities are. They were remarkably active throughout the COVID era. Before, remember when HIV/AIDS was a pandemic too? They did remarkable efforts at a minimum to destigmatize HIV positive sufferers. Some of you may remember, may have read, if you don't remember, may have read that one of the primary causes of the spread of HIV was the stigmatization leveraged against those who suffer and live with it. When they're stigmatized, they would not go for testing, they would not let people know, the infections spread. Destigmatization became a key aspect of treating and dealing and eventually overcoming in some societies, far from all, the spread of the infection and the infections. The same thing happened with Ebola. Religious institutions play a very critical role in the good and the bad. And because they play a role in the bad, such as stigmatization of HIV positive sufferers or Ebola, because they were insisting, some of them, that everybody had to come to the religious sites at the height of the COVID pandemic, because that's how God would save you. If you had to come to church or come to the mosque or whatever, there are those who say that too. And because there are those who say that too, it is important that they all get together to manifest and to realize the proper scientific messaging and provide the alternative ways of worship and prayer together and serve their respective communities together. That is the very simple magic to peaceful coexistence.
Can you share examples of times when Religions for Peace or you yourself have been dismissed at the UN in various capacities, either for your mission or your approach? I'd just be curious to hear any anecdotes on that.
When I first started to work very much on the issue of religious engagement, religion as part of the cultural imperative of learning about cultures of other societies as we deliver development assistance to them in the UN system, when I first started to get engaged in this space, I had a number of colleagues walk into my office and say, by the way, we just want you to know that this work that you are doing is an incredible waste of resources. We have such limited resources in the UN system. This kind of work where you're trying to engage religion for good, that's a waste. We all know that religions are only harm, only do harm, the main reason behind harm. A lot of them were women, by the way, incredibly accomplished and successful women who had suffered plenty as a result of certain religious beliefs and practices, norms and values in their own societies and with one another. I could understand very clearly the source of the anguish, but to assume that it is only about anguish was the problem. But I did have to confront some of them as they came into, and they literally uninvited would come in and say, it's just a waste. Just wanted you to know, we love you very much, but this is a waste. I also had some of my male colleagues in the UN system come and whisper, you're a nun, right? You must be a nun. I said, I'm a Muslim. We don't have nuns in Islam, but hey, if you want to do it, by all means, go ahead. I'm a nun. I'm a Muslim nun. By the way, there's a very beautiful picture in the New Yorker, one of the many cover pages of the New York, I think it's 2015, where you have 3 women sitting in a subway. I presume it's a New York subway, but it could be any subway. One is a Muslim wearing the hijab, on 3. So the one on this side is a Muslim wearing the hijab. The one on this side is a nun wearing a nun's outfit. And in the middle is a woman wearing a bikini. And it just shows you the different ways of being and existing. And the fact that our bodies as women will always be the symbolic space of trying to show what it is that we think and how we believe. So when people assume that religion doesn't matter, they might want to think of how women's bodies can be subjectified in such ways to make things matter, to make political statements. We see how rape has become a very widespread weapon of war because women's bodies are seen as the producers, as the site where you can put the spike in, and here you show that you are a good believer or you're not, or whatever it is. Plenty to do with religion. Also the reason why a number of Muslim women choose to wear the veil. It's a very complicated, complex space, but I think we need to appreciate that faith has a great deal to do with the way that politicians, financial experts, anybody heard of Islamic finance? It's a massively growing space. And now the UN is seeking money from Islamic finance sectors. That's a trend that you might want to be aware of, where religions pay money to the United Nations system to do its basic development and humanitarian work. It's an important trend. So as you decry religion, you might wish to see how the extent to which religions will go in order to make peace possible.
Thank you for that. We actually have a class on Islamic finance at Fletcher. So there you go, next year, taught by Ibrahim Worde. Okay, I have a question that came up in response to your statement, which many people will laugh that I'm asking this question because it's very typical of me. So I'm Iranian American, and as you all probably know by now, the revolution has been going on in Iran for the last 5 months regarding bodily autonomy at the beginning, but now it's kind of shifted to completely like dismissing the regime and calling basically for the Islamic Republic to no longer exist. And with that, there's been a lot of conversations around the hijab burning and anti-Islam symbols throughout the protests by Iranians. And it has both sparked uproar, but also regarding bringing in some nuance and bringing in religious and cultural literacy. We've kind of seen what that actually means, hijab burnings and etc. And so Dr. Karam, I'm curious, you talked about religions for peace, everyone being at the table, and specifically when it comes to women, when it comes to our bodies and representing, XYZ versions of faith traditions. I wonder what was the conversation within religions for peace responding to what was happening in Iran? Yeah.
So remember that what is happening in Iran, which is phenomenal, is also part of many things that are happening around the world. When you work in an international setting, you have to look at all the fires burning at the same time. And that means that there's an opportunity to see the different trends, but there's also, in a sense, sometimes you can't see the specifics of any one particular trend. But I can tell you that there's been different sets of reactions. On the one hand, there are those who are incredibly moved and motivated to do things together, precisely because this is a woman-led revolution, and perhaps one of the first in our modern times, a woman-led revolution. We would dare others to define a similar context. So there are those who are incredibly motivated, incredibly worried, but in a positive way, worried for the women, and incredibly energized to see this trend. In a way, some are also arguing and saying this is actually, to some extent, it's where we saw as a milestone in the women's rights movement, there was Me Too, which brought together so many women around the world to identify and to speak out against harassment, etc., and created such ripples and waves. And this is part of that milestone of women moving forward with their rights. There are those who will tell you that. And then you have the other extreme. One of the things about being in a multi-religious international organization is you will hear every single point of view at the same time. And the challenge becomes, can we maybe find a common narrative here? And it is actually possible. But let me just tell you what the other extreme is about what is happening in Iran. The other extreme, of course, is those who are arguing and saying, wait a minute, it is understandable that this is a cry for bringing down a regime that is seen as oppressive and illegitimate and undemocratic, but at the same time, this is a regime that has been elected, give or take whatever you understand from legitimate elections, but who would be the others? Who would replace in its space? And I think that is not necessarily, I'm not arguing for the justice of this argument or for the logic of it. I'm simply sharing the panorama of perspectives that are out there. What I have found particularly interesting amongst the different religious leaders is because these are people in religions for peace who have a history of engaging with one another, of serving together, of serving all communities together, there's a profoundly different way of thinking than what you would find amongst any other religious leader who doesn't necessarily have the same experience and expertise of engaging with one another. And I think this is one thing that we take so much for granted in the secular development and foreign affairs world, where we think, yeah, religious leaders are religious leaders, a religious leader, right? No, they differ profoundly. Those of them who have that experience of working together think about the world and practice their faith in very different ways, in very deep, profound, meaningful ways, because I would also venture to say that it's actually much more spiritual, the ways that these religious leaders who have worked and collaborated and partnered together live and breathe. And a common understanding, because they have come together to work together, not to obliterate certain rights, because there are other coalitions of religious leaders and religions who come together in opposition to certain human rights. Religions for Peace is qualitatively different. This is the community of religious leaders of their institutions who are coming together to defend and support and uphold human rights. So multiple layers of difference in this amazing community of institutions and people. Their perspective, by and large, is, as a common ground, any death by violence, any violent action is unacceptable, unreligious, and should not be condoned. That there are women protesting. They're protesting against the veil. Yes, it's an Islamic symbol. Yes, but they are protesting because they have rights to protest. They have a reason to protest, but they also have a right to protest. So by and large, the understanding is the violence inflicted against the protesters is absolutely unreligious and should never be sanctioned, no matter what. And that's a very powerful perspective and position, and never to be taken for granted, I think. So that's one of the advantages, if you will, of having people come together to serve together across their religious differences and across their national and regional differences, because they're committed to the goal of human rights for all, because that's the only means to dignity for all. Yes, we all believe in different things. Yes, human rights can sometimes be quantified as a Western thing, but actually all of them come with an understanding that this is deeply ingrained in every single spiritual tradition. That's why it's religions for peace. And that's why being able to work with these communities and to take them seriously is absolutely fundamental. This is not the same as being able to work with every single religious leader and take them seriously. There's a difference. The litmus test of working together to serve together, because then It's about not standing in opposition to human rights, but standing for human rights and dignity of every single human and the planet.
Thank you. Thank you for that beautiful answer. I have one last quick question. So think of your questions. We'll take about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. Dr. Karam, you have given us lots of insights to take with us. And my favorite two of the day was one, that religious leaders are the original diplomats. Being at a diplomacy school, I feel like we could take that with us. And also that the need for religious literacy and cultural literacy in the international affairs space is critical, because without it, if you're a diplomat or whatever career path you choose, without that, it's both insufficient and not efficient. But on that note, Dr. Karam, as a last question on my end, as future practitioners in the field of IR, what do you think the greatest need right now for our generation is? What is one thing you want to leave them with? Yeah, please.
Is that all? I would say, Ciara, I would say that I hope I've made the case for why religious literacy, not as in Islam 101, Christianity 102, Judaism, not as in that, but as in understanding the profound and varied and layered ways in which religions and faiths influence public life and our behaviors and attitudes and our politics, that kind of religious literacy. I hope I've been able to make a case for why that's really important for international relations today and going forward, because it also has to do with the history of international relations that was first forged by religiously inspired empires, right? So I hope that is one thing that I would say. I trust I've made the case. If I haven't made the case, I've failed miserably. But yes, I think students of IR need to understand and be well-versed in understanding how it is in that kind of religious literacy, which, by the way, is not about religion exclusively. Again, it's about the influence of religious institutions, thoughts, practices in public life on a whole range of issues. So it's actually looking to gender relations, it's looking to political history, it's looking to environmental conservation, it's looking to, you name it. It's that intersectionality of religious realities that is absolutely essential. What was the second part of the question?
Specifically, so what's one insight you want them to know? What's the greatest need or gap right now for our generation to look to fill?
That is one and the same answer, to be honest. One of the things, if I may, we learned from, we created a multi-religious humanitarian fund in April of 2020. It was the quickest ever fund to be created to serve humanitarian needs in the history of humanitarianism, quite frankly. But it was in response to the global lockdown and a realization that so much was going on around the world, and that, again, religious institutions were working at 1,001% to serve, but they were not working together. So we set up the fund to encourage religious communities, people of faith, to work together as they are facing exactly the same crisis in exactly the same communities together. And maybe you can work together. And here's a little bit of support, just a wee bit of seed money. One of the things we learned very, very quickly was that the largest number of applicants were actually young people with remarkable ideas. They were the ones who were willing to go against their particular technocracy, hierarchy of religious institution or political actors, and just get things done together. And I think that, and they were young people of faith, very much inspired by very different religious and faith traditions, but they wanted to work together and they wanted to serve together, and they had some remarkable ideas. And that gave me a tremendous amount of hope. And I would hope that as we speak of youth, because now engaging youth in this, positioning youth in that, youth are important here, there, and everywhere, that conversation is absolutely critical, is absolutely essential, is highly timely. But I would hope that as young people, you realize that, yes, of course, your role and your criticality and your influence is paramount, but it isn't only for yourselves as secular actors. It is also for those among you who believe in different faith traditions, and those who don't believe. But let us not forget that there are a significant number of young people who believe and they don't all believe and decide to go to blow themselves up. They believe and want to do good with their faith. So I would hope that the movement of youths globally takes into account that value added of belief and doesn't disrespect or disregard it, so that you don't call a Muslim woman a nun or tell them that the work that they're doing is irrelevant, but that you can see each other as dignified human beings who can be incredibly well inclined precisely because of the faith that you have. I would hope that that sensitivity is part of the youth movement, because it will also be the sensitivity required to understand that as young people take reins of power increasingly, they also owe the elderly a huge responsibility. It isn't only that our world is increasingly young, it is also that our world is increasingly elderly, and our elderly face incredible amounts of discrimination globally. I would hope that our young people can see the value of faith in people's lives, and that would inspire them also to see the value of the elderly in our communities.
Thank you. Let's give Dr. Karam, thank you, round of applause. And we're going to open up to a short Q&A. Hannah, and then is there another person that might have a question? Let's go with you in the green shirt as well. So Hannah, go ahead, and then we'll do 2 questions back to back. Is that okay, Dr. Karam?
Of course.
Cool. Hannah?
Hi, Dr. Karam. I wanted to ask if, in contrast to your experiences of religion being dismissed in your work at the UN, if you have any examples of times where you felt like you did get through to people, or felt like you made a big difference with your role in the UN.
You as well. Oops.
Thank you, Doctor. I'm actually came from the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I'm so ashamed of being not familiar with religion's role in diplomacy until now. So I'm so thankful for your presentation. And actually, I would like you to provide me practical tips of Japanese diplomats. For example, in Afghanistan, the Taliban is Islamic fundamentalism, and they believe in their faith and made a policy like to oppress the women and deprive the education opportunity from the women. So as you mentioned, I totally agree with the idea that we should, like many religions players, collaborate and rule together. But I'm afraid that like the faith is really hard to be compromised. So it's really difficult to for them to compatible with one another. So for example, in even human rights can be said to be a Western concept instead of universal idea. So how should Japanese diplomat can work and to encourage the compromise in there? Thank you.
Thank you. They're very, very smart and brilliant and challenging questions. So let me just, how shall I start? Did I make a positive impact? Good grief. I think history is the better judge of that. I would find it very odd to say, oh yes, I made a lot of great difference. It was absolutely awesome. I don't know, to be honest. I hope I did. I hope that by persisting in ensuring that we understood the basic facts and figures about, basic healthcare being provided by 40% of the world's religions, etc. I would hope that there was an impact. In fact, there were times, to be honest, when I was a bit worried that there was a bit too much impact. And let me explain. In the 20 years I spent in the United Nations, I started by saying we've got to do religion. We really do need to understand the religious impact, etc. And I got the response that Ciara mentioned in terms of we don't do religion. By the time I left, to be honest, I was going around saying, wait, you need to know who you're working with, why you work with folks in the religious sphere. You need to be a bit more discerning. You're just going gung-ho to engage with religious actors, some of which are actually arguing and debating and against human rights. Surely that should not be what the UN system does. Hello? So I could tell you, yes, it was such a good impact that it was actually leading to some harm. right? So that by the time I left, I was saying, you need to calm down and be discerning. You need to learn about literacy, folks, just a bit of religious literacy, and please be a bit more discerning who you engage and how you engage, right? So one could say that that was an impact. The question from the Japanese participant, I want to please nuance something, which perhaps you don't know. Religions for Peace was founded in Kyoto in 1970, and there was a group of religious Buddhist leaders and Muslim and Christian leaders from Japan itself, but also from around the world. So the notion that, you know, Japan doesn't know, there was since the Second World War, obviously a very deliberate, still is a very deliberate attack, a very deliberate attempt to not engage the religious in the public spaces. Obviously, if you study the history of World War II and the position of Japan therein and the arguments behind Japanese engagement and involvement, et cetera, you will understand why there was a very deliberate attempt to keep the religious out of the political and other spheres of life. However, that doesn't mean that there's been no religious consciousness in Japanese society. Quite to the contrary. I would also point to something that Religions for Peace did thanks to Rishoku Seikai, which is the Buddhist movement that was instrumental in founding Religions for Peace all those years and remains one of the longest and most steadfast supporters of the mission of Religions for Peace. And that took place in Tokyo last year in September, something called the Tokyo Peace Roundtables, which will also take place again, God willing, this year. What was that? That was a group of parliamentarians in Japan working with Buddhist religious leaders, Interreligious Council of Japan, of which it exists. There's a Religions for Peace in Japan, to invite religious leaders from the Ukraine and Russia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Afghanistan, Democratic Republic of Congo, to invite them to be together in spite of the fact that they were at war with one another. And it's the first and only situation. Everybody's inviting everybody around the table, but nobody is actually reflecting and giving time and space to religious leaders in the middle of a conflict. The actual religious leaders who are supposed to be on opposite sides of the conflict are on opposite sides of a conflict, to bring them together out of that space of conflict, not because you're trying to get them to mediate a peace treaty. Everybody's getting them to mediate peace treaties, all the politicians and whatnot. But this was actually a deliberate attempt to get them to sit together as people of faith, men and women of faith, to sit together and share what it is that they're going through in the midst of a conflict. What do they need? What are they already doing with one another, for one another? Because believe it or not, there's actual coexistence in the midst of a conflict. And this was the first and only opportunity to get them to exit that space of strife and sit and reflect together on what the realities were and what they needed and how they wanted to be supported. The Tokyo Peace Roundtable took place last year, and it will continue to try to bring out the religious leaders from moments and situations of strife in order to have that space to be with one another. It is priceless in every way, shape, or form. I also wanted to address your point about Afghanistan. Yes, you have fundamentalism practiced specifically, leveraged most specifically against women. There is no question about that. Can it be dealt with by ignoring it and just saying, well, that's Muslim fundamentalists for you, what did you expect? Or should it be handled as it is now by various attempts to engage the Taliban de facto government, because it's a de facto government, by trying also to engage them through their understanding of what their religious ideology seems to be. And that is why, at least a month ago, if not a little bit longer, a group of women came together, women of faith, came together and issued an open letter to the United Nations and to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. If you don't know the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, it's over 55 Muslim majority countries, so it includes even Nigeria and whatever. They sit on the Organization of Islamic Cooperation as member states. The open letter was basically asking them, as a UN system and as an Organization of Islamic Cooperation, whether they had taken the trouble to actually engage with the Taliban as community leaders, other community leaders, because it isn't just the Taliban in the country. The Taliban is the de facto government, but not everybody is a Taliban. But did they actually converse as organization of Islamic countries? Did they try to address the Islamic rationale that came out that is being used by the Taliban? It was just asking questions. It wasn't passing judgment in any way, shape, or form, but really just asking the question to the United Nations system. Have you engaged with community leaders in Afghanistan? Are you just sitting and talking to the secular folks who are your usual go-to? Because that obviously will only go so far. And to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, have you sought to engage the Taliban in their Islamic way of thinking, since you are all about Islamic? Just posing the questions. And the reason that is important is because we often assume that, well, they're bad, and they're going to be bad, and they're going to be bad. Well, what are you going to do with them? You have to deal with them. Women in Afghanistan need and have very clear ideas about what needs to be done with the government. And one of the questions posed, have you engaged with the diverse variety of women, including the religious women, about what they need in this space? The challenge is not that we lack mechanisms of international engagement. The challenge is that we very often think of these mechanisms as addressing people like us, who talk like us, who look like us, who think like us. And if we are coming from a secular space in which, quite frankly, the majority of our institutions around the world, the multilateral institutions around the world, tend to be from, they operate from relatively secular spaces. So their religious literacy is minimal. But then can we use that excuse for an Organization of Islamic Cooperation? Obviously not, in which case holding them accountable is a form of engagement, which is imperative. And that's why I was saying, I think our challenge is not so much that there will be fundamentalists always, religious and otherwise, including extreme white privileged fundamentalists. The challenge is not that fundamentalism will exist. The challenge is not that violence will always be a feature of our life. The challenge is how we work together to address these issues. And that's why when Ciara asked about young people, the question is, can we have the discernment and the sensitivity to understand the other and work with the other and indeed serve the other? And that's the question that we need to ask the religious leaders and their institutions. Well, are you serving only your own? Are you serving only with your own way of thinking? Or are you actually working together to serve together? Because in the process of serving all, you will have to come to terms with the fact that you have plenty that you agree about that is actually very good. The idea that there are some who will alienate and say human rights are Western and therefore irrelevant, those who do that are not part of the Religions for Peace movement. They're not part of the 97 interreligious councils around the world. Those who say that human rights are a Western concept are not willing to work together. That's your litmus test right there. That's how you know who to work with and who to observe carefully. Those faith leaders who work together, men and women, young and older, those are the ones who make peace possible. And those are the ones you need to focus on instead of only focusing on the fundamentalists. If you compare the amount of studies done on religious fundamentalism versus the amount of studies done on religious collaboration, I dare everyone to do that comparison and find out how many studies actually illustrate what religious communities do together to serve everyone. I dare you to go find that. Let's have a PhD, couple of PhD theses on that. Just compare and contrast how much is written about fundamentalisms and violence and how much is written about collaboration and peaceful coexistence. I would know, because if there were on the latter, they would at least come knocking on the door.
Dr. Karam, thank you. Thank you so much. I feel bad because not many people got to ask questions. Is one person like dying? They like really need to ask Dr. Karam a question. Brenda? Okay, Dr. Karam, this will be our last question and then we'll let you go as well.
Thank you, Dr. Karam. So these are maybe a couple of personal questions. Throughout my life, I had my education in missionary schools. I've been proud of them. But when I've gone through the preamble of the school, they would have said, this school is meant for Christians, however, others can also study here. Is it about time that we have matured enough to delineate education? When I heard about the Islamic finance, so that told me, is it about time that the more educated, as we say, the Global North should delineate education from religion. Likewise, my son is in UK and my son intends to stay in UK, but I understand the constitution of UK says this is a Christian country. It's about time that we can look at Universal Civil Code and say, well, religion apart, we are basically going with morality. Thank you.
Great questions. Thank you very much. Can I just say that the business of delineation is very critical. It's important to say, of course, that which is Caesar's and that which is God's. It's very good to have that clarity. But our lives have never been so clearly delineated in any way, shape, or form. If you want to see an example of delineation that goes horribly long, study the United Nations system, where there's 60 different offices, bodies, and complexes, each one dealing with one particular aspect of human life and existence. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. They're all doing remarkable service in their own right, in their own ways. But you know what? Delineation can be an extreme too, because our common humanity means that we will always have an intersection between different aspects of beliefs, different ways of life, and different existences. We don't find it very helpful that we would see a country define its laws per any one religious tradition. Of course, it significantly compromises our ability to understand that country's juridical openness and fairness in general. But the truth of the matter is, that's how the country defines itself. Does that mean that no non-Christian or no non-Muslim is entitled to dignity and equality in front of the law? When that citizen or person living in that country, by the way, there are 100 million displaced people in the world today. That's more than the population of many countries combined. So that's why I say citizen and person living in any one territory. Whenever there's a citizen and person living in one territory who's not getting entitled to their basic rights according to the law because of the religious reasons, that is a travesty of human rights. That is illegal, and that can be taken to court and held accountable. But can we change all the laws to say that no nation should be defined by any religious orientation? Yes, possibly, perhaps. But the point is, can we instead ensure that even in spite of whatever religious orientation, a national juridical process sees itself mired in, that does not, in practice, in legal terms and in practical terms, does not take away from the dignity and the access to justice of each individual living in that territory. When it starts to impede access to justice, that's when we take action, and we take action in that context. I would love to live in a world in which all faiths are acknowledged as equally important in any given geographic territory. I would aspire to such a case, but I would not necessarily feel comfortable insisting that no religion should get any acknowledgement in any legal system, in any geographic territory. So somewhere we need a balance between the two. I hope that somewhat doesn't necessarily answer, but engages with your question. Thank you.
Dr. Karam, thank you so much. Let's give another round of applause. Thank you very much. I wish you could be here with us, but it was a pleasure to engage with you via Zoom, and I hope me and others cross paths with you in the future in your work at Religions for Peace. And hopefully we'll take back a lot of insights to the rest of the Fletcher community and broader Boston community in our own work as practitioners. So again, thank you very much. We appreciate everything.
Thank you all. Thank you very much for the opportunity. My apologies for not being with you. Thank you so much for the questions. Blessings.
And with that, the long day has basically come to an end. We have a cocktail hour now. Yes. At the up in the 7th floor at Cabot. But I wanted to just extend again an incredible thanks to all of you for attending.